Hello, BookTube. I know I said yesterday that I was presenting you with my last used book haul of 2017 because time away from the puppy is so hard to find. But it happened again today. So this is my positively, absolutely final used book haul of the year. And it's also enormous. I'm without my burly teenagers these days, and so of course it's these days that I'm getting the heaviest books. Uh, but I have a bunch here, a bag full, a tote bag full, and I wanted to show them to you, just because it doesn't feel right for me not to show you books. And the first three are Penguin Classics for the wall of penguins in the back there, which is ever growing, but that's okay. I wouldn't mind at all. I've said this a few times. I wouldn't mind at all if this whole room were penguins. I would make room elsewhere. If I could walk into this room and it was all Penguin Classics, I'd be okay with that. But anyway, the first one is a Penguin Classic that I didn't have in a standalone, and it has a new introduction that I've never read. It's Daisy Miller by Henry James, with a tiny little thing. It's so short that Sean the Book Maniac probably wouldn't bail on it. And speaking of Sean the Book Maniac, I found this, the Penguin Classic Portable Edith Wharton. And of course, when I was looking through it, I immediately went in the table of contents for the short story Zingu, which he talked about on his channel and praised. I read it eons ago, and sure enough, it's in here. So while I was out and about, I read it. I read it again, and it is utterly delightful. It's true that it takes a swipe at the novels of Anthony Trollope, but it's utterly delightful and so quotable. Lines that you want to just use for the rest of your life. She looked at you. One character looks at another character like she thought there was something wrong with her hat. But the thing that struck me this time around, aside from how utterly delightful it is, Sean is absolutely right about that. It's delightful. Is how mean Edith Wharton is to her female characters. She's stupidity and complacency bother her just across the board, but stupidity and complacency in her fellow women. Oh my God! It brings out the great white shark in her. It's a merciless short story, just merciless. And that reminded me of another thing, which is how much I love Edith Wharton's short stories. I so concentrate on her novels that I forget that she was equally good at short stories. So I'm gonna read a bunch of those. And then the last of the Penguin Classics is far less known than the other two. It's Petersburg. By Andrei Bely, which is a pen name for Boris Nikolaevich Bugayev, who was the son of a poobah. His father was well known in academic circles. So when the son joined a weirdo hipster art movement of the time, at the beginning of the 20th century, he was behooved to use a pseudonym. And this novel I have read, but I have not read it. I've never had the black spined script title Penguin Classic, and that's great because it will give me a reason to reread it. I don't understand why this novel isn't better known, because well, I admit I've only read it once, but I thought it was brilliant. So those are the three Penguin Classics, and then I also got a Mouse Market paperback, which I tell myself I'm never going to do. I find them a little bit uncongenial to read. But I think I showed it on this channel. There's a series of old Bantam Classics. Bantam Classics don't look like this anymore. They look like this for a little window when whatever art director they had made them all look sort of the same. And I thought they were very pretty things. For some reason. Just the whole line of Bantam Classics in this particular white-spined set of mass markets with artwork on the cover, I really like. And I found The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton in that edition, and got it because all of these things were virtually free. There was almost no price tag to any of them. Like for instance, this thing, I got this because it was virtually free. A perfect condition copy of Where the Wild Things Are. It's as clean and clear as the day it was bought, and there it was, just floating around out in the world. And this is an orange spine Penguin Classic of the collected novels of Franz Kafka. Look at that cover. Look at how brutal it is. And this has the trial and the castle, and I think it has America as well. Just in a one-volume thing. I doubt very much that I will keep this, This was more the kind of thing that I get in order to give away, which I keep telling myself I'm not going to do. That's how you accumulate books. And these 2 back-to-back trips out and about to all the venues where I can find used books and where they can find their way into my tote bag is a perfect reminder to me that that's where excess books come from. When the books come in the mail, free in the mail for professional consideration, they have a timestamp right on them. At least for me, not maybe for a lot of critics that I know, but for me, I get, if I get 7 books in the mail, I view them as, okay, here is either something that I don't want at all or something that I must work on. But I almost never view them as something that I personally want to keep. So those go in and out. But if you go to a used bookstore and you pay $1 or $2 for a book, there's that much more reluctance to get rid of it. And when you go to a used bookstore or venues like the ones I went to today, where the proprietor is basically saying, why don't you just, here's a table, we had a charity sale, this is what's left, I'm just going to have to throw these things away, I have no place for them, why don't you go through them and see what you want, just take whatever you want. When something like that happens, where there's literally no drag at all, then you end up loading yourself with books that you don't really want to keep. So, and a pristine copy of Where the Wild Things Are is a perfect example of that. So what if it's pristine? I already have a copy. And the collected novels of Franz Kafka, when I am well known on record as not particularly liking anthologies of novels, I kind of like to be in the mood for one novel at a time. They're perfect examples. But still, I'm still going to give them some love before I send them on their way. And then the next one is Volume 1 of a 2-volume fantasy epic by Stephen Donaldson. And since I say 2-volume fantasy epics, those of you who know his work will know it right away. This is The Mirror of Her Dreams. The series is called Mordant's Need. And this is huge. Volume 1 is huge. The second volume is A Man Rides Through, and it's also huge. And it's about a mousy woman who lives in an apartment full of mirrors, and she's wealthy, so she doesn't need to work, and she is introvert, so she doesn't have any friends, doesn't have any lovers, doesn't have any kind of an outside social life. And one day, she sees a man in one of her mirrors, and he is from a kingdom on the other side of that mirror. And it turns out in that kingdom, the kingdom that Donaldson has created, mirrors are rare and hard to make and focuses of magic. Here in our world, they're commonplace, but in Mordant, they're not. And she travels there and has all sorts of adventures there. And of course, as you can tell, no offense to Brandon Sanderson, but as you can tell, the 2 volumes are drastically overwritten. But I seem to remember liking some of them. There's a creepy sexual vibe going on between an older sorcerer in the alternate, in the fantasy world, and our main character. She's always in love with the young man she sees in her mirror, but there's a creepy vibe going. I'll be interested in reading it again. I haven't read it since it first came out. That was 30 years ago. I'll be interested in reading it again and seeing if that vibe either bothers me more or if I was making too much of it at the time. But either way, it was virtually free, so I grabbed it. Same thing with this. Oh, I love this novel so much, and this is the ARC of the novel, which I had once upon a time, but you never see it. It's Vikram Chandra, Sacred Games, another chunker, a gigantic book about taking place in the city that I guess political correctness now forces me to call Mumbai. It's the story of a Bombay policeman who's a Sikh and who's a fantastic character, and whose life is starting to pall when all of a sudden he's starting to feel like he's past his sell-by date. When all of a sudden he's brought into a tense and violent and then very violent and then incredibly violent encounter with the sort of the kingpin of crime in Bombay. And there's a gigantic cast of characters, and despite the fact that there's violence all through here, it's actually very funny, including the opening scene, which is not for the faint of heart, especially dog lovers, but which is very funny. But despite the fact that there are hundreds of characters, it's really a story of those two men and the battle of wills between them, and the fact that they make the whole city into their chessboard. I just love it. I think it's fantastic. And so when I saw this, I had to grab it, even though I already have a copy. And then there's this thing from a couple of years ago that I got in the mail. I got it as an advance copy and got rid of it. But that's an example of the corrective process. Now, if I lived, in Moose Jaw, Idaho, and got 10 books in the mail, but had no place to get rid of them and no place to buy other books, no Brattle bookshop, no charity shops that have walls of books. If I didn't have that to look for these things, then I would probably keep a lot more than I do. But as it is, I get rid of it and I wait for it to prey on my mind. I wait for me to think about it. And I've thought about this. This is David Milne's World Making. It's a narrative history of the saga of American foreign diplomacy. And it's stuck in my mind. It's rare for nonfiction to do, but there's a lot of meta-analysis in here. I think that's what did it for me. That I kept thinking about it. I've kept thinking about it, and it's very rare, but it does happen. Wishing that I hadn't got rid of it. So when I found it, I think this was 50 cents. When I found it, I grabbed it right away. And then the last thing I want to show you this time around, the find of the day, is from the Brattle Bookshop. Of course, you would never find this anywhere else. And it's fantastic. Oh, it's Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the memoirs of Viscount Grey of Fallodon, of the early part of the 20th century British aristocrat and government worker. He was foreign secretary for over a decade, a very long time, of just having one steady hand on the wheel. He married, knew everybody, was cousins of first or second cousins of virtually everybody in the British government. His first wife was wealthy and famous. His second wife was even wealthier and even more famous. The home at Fallodon Hall is just incredible. And he is a very good, very engaging prose stylist. You wouldn't think it. If you looked at this, if you didn't know who he was and you saw this on a used bookstore shelf, you'd just keep right on looking. But there's actually a world in these two volumes. He's a very good writer. He wrote actually a book on fishing that's incredibly engaging, even if you don't fish. And these are his memoirs of 25 years in the heart of British government. And it doesn't, don't let the title fool you. When people came into bookstores for this, it was a modest hit of its kind. When people came into bookstores, they didn't ask for 25 years. They asked for Grey of Fallodon. That's what they said. And everybody, all the booksellers knew what they were talking about. And this is all about, it's about a lot of things. It's a gallery of personalities. I read it, of course. I have already read this. I read it back when the Boston Athenaeum had a set. I think they might still. I might be the only one who's ever checked it out. But in addition to the gallery of personalities and whatnot and all the great dialogue, he's such a good ear for dialogue, there's also the looming specter. There is actually a kind of a through line. I wouldn't call it a plot, but there's a looming specter in these books as World War I gathers on the horizon. This horrifying thing that everyone for the last 30 years had been alternately dreading and just confidently expecting would happen. And actually, Grey of Fallodon is the one who quoted the famous line. He came up with the famous line that the lights are going out all over Europe to dramatize the fact that the darkness of war was gathering and that who knew what lay on the other side of it. And it's absolutely fascinating. I won't bore you any more about this, I promise. This is a clear Steve book. But it's absolutely fascinating for me. I can't wait to reread these. I will probably reread these before the new year. But it's absolutely fascinating to watch this principled, extremely intelligent, capable, worldly wise man grapple with that oncoming thing. This enormous oncoming thing
that every instinct of his is telling him ought to be forestallable or preventable by men just like him, and yet he knows it's coming, and there's nothing he can do about it. I just find that tone all throughout fascinating. So there you go. That is my absolutely positively final used book haul of 2017. And I'll wrap it up here for now, but I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.